The sources that I use for this Sankofa stories is taken from Professor Walker's book, Blacks and Religion, Volume 2, as well as his book, When We Ruled, as well as quotes from Professor A.H. Sayce written in 1911. In 2545 BC, a new set of rulers conquered Egypt, the Hyksos. Manetho informs us that a blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force, they easily seized it without striking a blow, and have overpowered the rulers of the land. They have burned our cities ruthlessly, and treating all the natives with cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. Finally, they appointed as a king one of their number, whose name is Salidas. These conquerors, the Hyksos, were of West Semitic origin and dominated the land for 669 years, ruling as the 15th and 16th dynasties of Egypt. Dynasty 15 consisted of 32 kings, 24 of which were named in Greek language in a document called the Book of Sothis. The origin of the Hyksos remains deeply controversial. Many writers, echoing Josephus, the great Roman Jewish historian, identify them as ancient Israelites. If this is true, then the Old Testament, the Tanakh of the Bible, is largely, if not completely, false. Manetho, the ancient Egyptian historian, records a story that raises critical questions to the validity of the Israelites being supposedly enslaved in Egypt and led out by Moses. Manetho tells of how the Jews entered Egypt as a part of a conquering group called the Hyksos. After the 16th dynasty, the Hyksos were chased out by 17th and 18th dynasty rulers. The Hyksos then founded the city of Jerusalem. It's possible that the chasing out of the Hyksos is the same story that was spun in the biblical scrolls of the Exodus. The biblical story of the Jews being slaves in Egypt and the story of Jews being conquerors of Egypt, as told by Manetho, obviously cannot harmonize with each other. Moreover, there is an additional argument put forward by some scholars who claim that Moses was in fact a real person, mentioned by different classical authors. However, there is no evidence that Moses was a Jew. Some claim Moses was actually an indigenous Egyptian priest whose teachings were hijacked by Judaism. Again, this idea cannot be harmonized with the other ideas presented in this video. For the record, I have no idea which version is the correct one. Then we have a famous stele associated with the 19th dynasty Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah. The stele, according to Wikipedia, mentions in the second to the last line, quote, Israel is laid to waste and his seed has not, end quote. This suggests that the 14th century BCE, Israel existed as a state within the Canaan region. Now, what do we make of this? One plausible story could be this. The Israelites were indeed the Hyksos who ruled Egypt as the 15th and 16th dynasties. Indigenous rulers of the 17th and 18th dynasties broke their power and chased them out in 1709 BCE, where they fled to Palestine and established a state. This kingdom was the one that was mentioned to be, quote, laid to waste in the stele of Pharaoh Merneptah. What's the problem with this interpretation? Well, many scholars and many pious religious people have a profound problem with this because, number one, it contradicts the Tanakh, or the Old Testament narrative of the Israelites being enslaved in Egypt. And secondly, it implies that a state in Israel existed before 1308 BCE. Even short chronologists would place the end of Pharaoh Merneptah's reign at 1203 BCE. The problem with this is that the Tanakh places the start of the reign of Saul, the first king of Israel and Judah, around 1050 BCE, which was much later. Thus, the Stele of Merneptah alludes to a prehistory of Israel that is not recognized by the Tanakh. On the other hand, the time period from King Saul to King Solomon, which was 1050 to 931 BCE, the period recognized and valorized by the Tanakh, has left behind very little archaeological evidence. This is why many scholars question the historical validity of the Tanakh. There is archaeological evidence that the Jews left Egypt for Palestine. This evidence is not the same as the Exodus, since this evidence is much later than the alleged period of the Exodus. The archaeology of Israel are controversial indeed. This has led many to deny the existence of Abraham, Moses, Aaron, and many biblical figures. However, what is not controversial is the site that was found on Elephantine Island on the Egyptian-Nubian border, a synagogue that had the name the Temple of Yahu. Across from this Jewish temple was an Egyptian temple, and the Jewish temple was built after the Egyptian temple and shared the same dimensions, was made of similar materials, and had a very similar construction. Now, along with this synagogue, there was also found 5th and 6th century BCE manuscripts. Professor A.H. Sayce wrote about this in 1911, and this is what he said. I also came across some fragments of Jewish pottery. It is clear, therefore, that at the time the temple was erected, the Jews were not only a large and wealthy community at Elephantine, but also that they must have possessed great political influence. Again, this goes in direct opposition to the biblical narrative of the Jews being slaves in Egypt. According to Professor A.H. Sayce, they had great political influence and had freedom to worship their god Yahu, who later became Yahweh, while the Egyptians still were able to worship their gods, while the Jews were able to worship their God. The history of the Jews is controversial indeed.